Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the High Dragon's Breath Bow Wow, coming back at you with more Archon's Armory. Today's topic, Terminator armor. Hopefully part of a two-parter that we can get going as we continue on to the rest of our basic Warhammer lore series. So without further ado, let's get right into the mythos. Here we have our lovely son of Horus, a little bit post-heresy in cataphracty pattern Terminator armor, with his absolutely dripped out power axe, combi melta, and chain bayonet build. A very classic heresy build. So, let's talk about myths. The pinnacle of protection. Now, this is a genuine argument with Terminator armor. There's not much protection that really rivals the level of Terminator armor. It is, at bare minimum, usually twice as thick as standard marine armor in almost every consideration. And while it has weak spots, those weak spots have a remarkable level of resistance, even when compared to standard Space Marine power armor. So, this is one of those times when those myths are getting close to the truth. Terminator armor really is almost the pinnacle of personal protection in the Imperium. The only thing that really comes over this is mastercrafting, dreadnoughts, and some versions of Custodes power armor. But as far as things that you're likely to see in your lifetime as a soldier in the 41st millennium, Terminator armor is pretty much about as good as it's going to get. But, as with everything in this series, there are myths to be disambiguated. The first one is the assumption that Terminator armor is just invulnerable to everything. It's shielded, it's pavist, it's aegis, it's impossible to damage. It's simply too tough to fail. And of course, as we know from our power armor video 3 days ago, my thank you for your patience, by the way, in my making of this video and the ones to come right after it, that armor, no matter how thick, no matter how tough, no matter how legendary, is always vulnerable to something and is always at risk of bad luck, persistence, and negligence in terms of maintenance. Irreplaceable. Now, with power armor, this is much more of an argument. There are certainly forms and patterns of Terminator armor that are no longer produced by one side or another during the modern day. For example, the Loyalist side really doesn't produce cataphract armor anymore, whereas the Chaos side, they might not produce the more modern versions of power armor, but we actually have very good evidence that at least the Iron Warriors maintain the ability to produce cataphract power armor, granted, of a pattern and a variant that is different and more modernized for the modern day, but at least we know that Terminator armor, while, 2 to 3 times as expensive because of its increased thickness, its arcane systems, and its complex manufacture, as well as the very expensive materials used to create it, it is not irreplaceable. Again, think power armor, there's not people churning out dozens of suits, but there are certainly individuals who repair and create replacement parts, as well as likely a few small individual groups who have managed to create power armor of the modern patterns. Mainly, I'm talking about Indomitus here for the Loyalists. It is a not necessarily entirely post-heresy pattern, but it is at least a design that came out and became popular after the heresy, implying that as its increased availability, it is being produced somewhere. Finally, the wonder material. And I say for real this time because for once we're not talking about ceramite with all of its various deficiencies and its, comparison with steel. We're talking about a genuine wonder material here. Adamantium. Something that makes up a large portion of the protection in most Terminator armor, including usually the helmet and many of the joints, is adamantium. Because the heavy carriage of cataphract and other Terminator armor is made of very thick, very heavy slabs of ceramite, while lighter than steel, it is still much heavier than standard power armor, and to make a equivalent level of thickness in comparison to Space Marine power armor, the armor would simply be too thick. So in its place, the various forces that produce or source Terminator armor, or tactical dreadnought armor, have replaced many of the weak spots and many of the joints and coverings of Terminator armor with adamantium. Now, I've gone over this with some people in the comments before, and I have a slightly different view on how exactly adamantium works. Now, there's all kinds of claims about it being a unique isotope, or some sort of steel derivative, or some sort of particular unique material, some new element. I take a slightly dim view of the idea of creating new elements from nothing. Adamantium, especially in how it's described, it is slightly lighter or of equal weight to steel, and yet it is double the toughness with similar levels of ductility to regular metals. Now, that sounds too good to be true, and I would certainly agree in many cases it is, but with adamantium I believe there's a reason. Now, there are grades to adamantium is what I would say, and the higher grade stuff is exactly what it sounds like. It's double steel. That's generally what I call it. Double steel or extra steel. So, adamantium is effectively a high-density titanium steel alloy, or something of similar type, where it mixes the high density and durability of a denser material, like titanium, that is also lighter than steel, and alloys it at a very, very high temperature with steel. Now, there's many reasons why this might be the case. My reasoning is twofold with this, and I am going to be speaking about this at length in this portion of the video because it plays into a lot of my analysis later on. Adamantium is described in the Imperium as a rare material that is generally mined in small quantities and then transported to Forge World for forging into very particular, very important, and very, very expensive items and gear. Now, some people might cite items like chain swords or power weapons as being made of adamantium, and I would agree. However, not all of those weapons are made to the same spec, and we know that power weapons do not have to be made of adamantium. They can be made of regular steel. Indeed, as well, chain swords and chain blades, particularly, do not need to be made of adamantium. And of course, with adamantium being like a titanium steel or any type of steel alloy, it is likely to be rather brittle, as it's forged at a very high temperature, and incredibly tough and durable. So, the double steel, the adamantium, it is, again, in my assumption, or in my estimation, it is going to be mined from the absolute best quality iron available, stuff with a very high amount of carbon, to increase the longevity of the metal during the forging process. It will then be doped or effectively melted down with a small amount of titanium in a particular ratio based on what is expected. If you want more ductility, more ability to flex or bend, you're going to want to use more steel. If you want high rigidity and very high precision with adamantium, you're going to add more, titanium or other, high sharpness, high fidelity metals that can mix in with the metal. And the reason why I say that adamantium is so rare is not necessarily for this specific picking out process, because, with lower grade adamantium, of course, you could have somebody making it on the cheap who's just mixing, dollar store titanium with some cheap iron and then melting it down at below the required temperature and calling it adamantium. Not likely to actually work at the same level. It's probably not going to offer you that same double steel, that same protection, or that same damage level that adamantium is. However, when it comes to the forges, when it comes to the individuals who really know how to make the stuff of good quality, they're going to do high-grade adamantium. Now, high-grade adamantium, as I said, it starts with those custom-picked, almost isotopes or pieces or types of materials. So, specific types of iron that are known for high carbon content, specific isotopes or even, finenesses of titanium or other materials that are going to be doped into the metal to increase its toughness and its durability. Those are then taken to a forge and heated at an unbelievable temperature. So we're talking about something that couldn't really be reached by, a Bessemer process or any other type of modern steel usage. We're talking about something that will increase the temperature of the metal to a point where it is almost chemically unstable. One of the issues with heating up steel to a super high temperature is that it becomes incredibly brittle. So it will lose all of the carbon in itself, and it will become, it'll become weaker. It will shatter more, it'll crack more. The reason that adamantium doesn't do this, in my estimation, is that doping process. Effectively taking titanium or another very dense, very high resistance metal, and as you're slowly increasing the heat of adamantium, level by level, hundreds or thousands of degrees, until it's absolutely liquid white hot. You're doping it at every step with these denser metals. And maybe it's even a combination. Maybe it could be, at the lower end, titanium, then depleted uranium, then other things. But effectively, this doping process is what makes that double steel, because not only do you put in more carbon at every step, keeping the steel from becoming too brittle and, weakening over reforging, you're also going to extend this process into like days or maybe even weeks of constant heating, constant, consistent heating. That's really the thing where I say, Manufactorum could not manage to make adamantium. Now, there's all types of adamantium derivatives. Things like in Darktide, they have Mobian steel, which is like a similar thing. It's a particular steel that comes from the world, and they have a process that they use to make this high carbon, tough armored steel. Now, they do that essentially as a discount version of adamantium. Adamantium is effectively steel, but a little bit lighter or of equal weight, depending on the grade. Again, lower is probably going to be heavier, higher is probably going to be lighter, or the other way around. It entirely depends on what's going to be used for. So weapons, it would probably be lighter, but armor, it probably doesn't matter. You probably want heavier. And what it has material-wise is effectively, it has the flexibility and the ability to be, manipulated like steel, but it is roughly twice as resistant to shock and penetration. So we have this kind of in our own day when it comes to things like high density alloy aluminums. It would be a very similar doping process to aluminum armor, essentially. But obviously using much heavier materials and at incredibly high temperatures. We're talking at points where super dense materials will liquefy, and forges are having to keep a consistent temperature over this whole time. And the real kicker with why adamantium is so difficult to get your hands on and so difficult to work with is because once it is cooled down, once it is forged and done being manipulated, it can't really be reheated unless you bring it back to that super high temperature. It has an increased thermal resistance because it's been doped with so many other metals, increasing its density, changing its chemical properties, decreasing its reactivity, as of normal steel. And so once it is, formed into, say, the vambrace or the helmet or the joints of Terminator armor or any other material or the blade of a weapon, you can't really unmake it as easily. It would be incredibly difficult, and you'd have to bring it back to a forge and pretty much start that whole process over again. So that's my reasoning, and that's why I say Terminator armor uses, in place of steel, it uses adamantium of an equal thickness to Space Marine power armor, but because it is adamantium, it is double the toughness, or effectively double the armor protection. So that's enough of me sparking about interesting materials right now. I will go into it again later when we talk about protection. So, lovely Terminator here. Reality of Terminator armor. This is going to be a slightly longer video as I have a great deal of information to process and a huge amount of images to go over because it's one of my absolute favorite pieces of armor in 40k's Terminator armor. Let's analyze the pictures here first. So, this is one of my favorite scenes from the entirety of the Night Lord series. This is the death of Nostromo. So you have Jago Sevatarian, Sevatar, on the bridge of one of the ships that have been ordered to destroy the homeworld Nostromo, with the rest of the Cataphract Terminators for the Night Lord's Legion, the Atramentar. So he is first captain. He is in a pretty nice, I would say, master-crafted Cataphracti set. And you'll notice, in comparison to the gentleman behind him, he is in a much more, while it's robust, while it's very thick, you can see these almost like barrel legs that go up to enormous thighs. If you look at his torso, comparison to the other Cataphracts, he is in much lighter torso armor. So he is a lot more mobile than they are, which is kind of on par for Sevatar because he doesn't like to be in Terminator armor so much. He has admitted that he prefers his personal set of mastercrafted armor because the Terminator armor interferes with his ability to be a duelist. And because Sevatar is one of the best duelists of all of the legions, don't at me, because Sevatar is one of the best duelists of all of the legions, we can take him as an example of some of the limitations of Terminator armor. As he describes it as, he feels restricted, he doesn't like how he can't move his arms as much, he definitely prefers, what he calls delicate work or dueling in his artificer power armor, and he considers the Cataphract armor or the Terminator armor to be armor for dirty business, is what he calls it, our armor for dutiful business, which for him means killing other Astartes, pretty much. He essentially equates putting on his Cataphract armor as admitting that he's going to have to kill some of his brothers. And that's one of the other things, Terminators and their advantage over standard Marines. And over here we see the hectic process of getting a Blood Angel set up and prepared in their Terminator armor. So here's one of the few examples we have of a Marine in Terminator armor and getting suited up. So you can see, I just want to draw your attention to this. I will get to the other details here, but all of these serfs, all these blessings, servitors, etc., he is sitting in this enormous chest piece. So this is all put together pretty much, minus some add-ons, obviously, over his heart. He's missing a section. He's missing parts on his waist. But you can see here, look at his thigh. His thigh is missing a plate, but underneath it you can see this thick joist of metal and a thin sheen, a thin metal sheet. That, in my estimation, is what stands in for the black carapace for Terminator armor. And that is what is made of adamantium. That underlayer, what in power armor is the black carapace, those coiled skeins of steel, and the kind of thick overlayer that covers them and interfaces with the armor. For the Terminator, they have a different type of interface. Obviously, it's much larger. It has more connections to the brain than it has to necessarily body parts. Obviously, it is also attached to body parts, but it is, so big that it has central control a lot more than like peripheral control. You can see the extra servos on his shoulders. You can see all these joists up his arm, but there's still a metal tube. There is sectioning here that is that adamantium covering. And if you look down here in the corner, you can see his shoulder plate being prepared, his other shoulder plate being slid into place, and you see this over here on the upper right of the corner. You can see a secondary shoulder plate. Now, clearly this is his shoulder plate. This is his pauldron here. But this is what I want to talk about with Terminator armor. One of the reasons why it's so bulky and so huge is because there are secondary mounting joists for a lot of the armor. So there are almost double layered plates on a large portion of the protection. And you can see it with Cataphract armor even easier. You can see there's clearly an over pauldron and an under pauldron before ever you get to the underside of the actual armor. And Sevatar here obviously is wearing a slightly lighter or a modified version of Cataphract armor. We will get to more versions here. And it looks like this gentleman is in Indomitus pattern, which we will also get to later. But I just want to draw your eyes. This is an incredible image if you take a few minutes to actually look at it. And of course, Sevatar looks incredible in his Terminator armor, and he's awesome. So, the realities of Terminator armor. I know, this is getting longer and longer as I go. I apologize. I just really want to get everything out there so I don't forget. So, Marines and others. Generally, Terminator armor is restricted to the Oedipus Astartes, and where it isn't, it tends to be used by the Inquisition. Some other species can use something equivalent to Terminator armor, but true Terminator armor, and especially the heavier patterns, has never really been reached technology-wise by anyone outside of mankind. So it's very limited. It's rare even among Astartes. For every 100 regular Marines, there might only be 1 or 2 Terminators. In some forces. In other forces, they are significantly more common, but they are never a standard unit outside of the first company of most chapters, or Primarch personal guards back in the day, some of which are still extant. For example, the Atramentar technically are still a fraternal brotherhood within the Night Lords, but their armor as well as their, unified position are shattered, basically to the winds. So, not as organized. The same thing for the Iron Warriors and other Terminator elites of the Chaos Legion. They've kind of fractured and shattered, and they no longer have the organization that they used to. But you will still run into them in knots and groups every now and then. Groups of 5, groups of 10, maybe, if there's a very strong warband. But not all of them are going to be from the Heresy. Plenty of them will be using in and out types of suits. So, let's continue on. Vulnerabilities. Now, we talked about materials. Adamantium, it's resistant. It's essentially double steel for the same amount of weight. The other one is absolutely enormously thick ceramite. In general, you can just look at Terminator armor as being 2 times as protected as standard Space Marine armor, basically everywhere. And that's a baseline. Even the weakest Terminator armor is at least twice as protective as standard Space Marine armor. That doesn't mean that it's totally invulnerable, and we'll go over some of the weak points or some of the weaknesses of the armor a little bit later, but just for right now, think adamantium instead of steel as the underlayer, especially in a lot of the weak spots that we're going to point out, and very thick, triple or double thick. So where before I put Marine armor as being between 1 inch and 3 inches thick, you can expect the bare minimum for Terminator armor is going to be 2 inches thick on almost every portion of the body, no matter if it's limbs or whatever, and up to 6 inches thick. So the shoulders of Cataphract armor, probably 6 inches thick of straight up ceramite. The breastplate of traditional Terminator armor, probably about 6 inches thick, and then backed with that adamantium protection. So it is incredibly tough to get through Terminator armor. It is both exosuit and armor. So Terminator armor is even more reliant on its servos. You can see here where standard Space Marine armor had like 1 or 2 servos to control the arm, 1 in the shoulder and 1 across the chest or back, and a couple on the legs and a couple on the calves. Look how big the Cataphracti calf is. That has probably got a double shot of like servo motors pushing his leg up and down, that big thumping tread of Terminators crushing the ground beneath them. The amount of extra assistance for the Marine to move in Terminator armor is probably twice as much as standard armor, which is often why Terminators describe it as being more in control of a vehicle or a mech than they're in a suit of armor. So you can see over here, this entire limb is joisted by servos. These are essentially pneumatic or electronic control surfaces or traction surfaces that can contract and expand and change their pressure in order to move the limb as the Marine's mind and body are willing it. We'll get into that in a bit. But in addition to that, of course, like power armor, there is the undersuit, and then there is the oversuit, the actual armor, the ceramite, if you will. Then, moving on, complexity of training and manufacture. So, manufacture, obviously we went over before. Adamantium is time-consuming, expensive, complicated, very hard to reforge, and thus very hard to repair. The ceramite obviously is thicker, and even though ceramite is just a kind of metal-doped or metal-alloyed ceramic material, in order to make a lighter, thermally resistant armor that can still be cast, or at least, cut to the size and shape required, Terminator armor just turns all of that manufacturing cost up to 10. It's incredibly expensive, heavy, thick, all of that nonsense. The issue comes in a lot of the time with complexity of training. Now you might think, well, Space Marines train with power armor forever and they get very good at it, or, they can psycho-indoctrinate. Terminator armor is genuinely something that you almost need to get entirely retrained with. Because not everyone in a Legion, Warband, chapter, etc. was going to use Tactical Dreadnought armor or Terminator armor, they didn't get psycho-indoctrinated for it at the beginning. They would get psycho-indoctrinated for it when they were chosen, naturally. And then the real issue was retraining them so that they're not used to using power armor as much as they are Terminator armor. Now, there are individuals like Sevatar who would switch back and forth, but generally they would have a preference. A lot of Marines preferred Terminator armor for its protection and its increased strength, but there really was this consistent undercurrent of it's an honor to wear Terminator armor because people knew how much effort went into using those suits. Now, I have here ripping your muscles and crushing your friends. Terminator armor is so much heavier than standard Space Marine armor that rather than moving an arm and contracting your muscles in order to move a limb, you're shifting your hands and then you start to move with the servos, or you almost push into the servos to let them know that you want to move that way. So you get this kind of quick jerk of motion, and then the rest of the arm essentially moves. So there's almost input lag. I wouldn't say it's like a negative input lag because the armor is, for something that we'll discuss in a second, this kind of issue of, your mental impulse to the armor being delayed or being different from the actual movement or unintentionally going too far because it's mostly mechanical and no longer mostly physical. So before, the servos were helping you do what you already wanted to do. If I was lifting something in power armor, I would set my shoulders, put my hands underneath it, and lift with my muscles. And then as I do that, the armor will naturally react and use the servos in my shoulders and back to straighten my back and the ones in my legs to push upward, and all of a sudden I'm lifting something that I couldn't have without my armor. With Terminator armor, I would put my hands underneath something and I would pull with all of my might, and then essentially I would be pulling, be consistently applying pressure, and then all of a sudden the armor snaps into motion and I lift up something so much heavier than I possibly thought I could have. And instead of, coming up to the place where I thought my arms were going, the impulse continues and I could essentially throw this over my back, or I could just lift it over my head by accident. It's very much a thing of Terminator armor goes from being very twitchy, in the fact that it wants to obey your command, it wants to follow your instruction, but because of the delay of your muscles having to fight against the servos, or having to kind of, your flesh is having to fight for nuance against the machine that you're piloting. So a lot of the time you see this with running. Marines try and run in Terminator armor, they try and sprint, and all of a sudden they're kind of take one too big of a step, and they try and pull back, and oh my goodness, my thigh joint just shattered, I broke my hip. Or I reach out with an arm to grab something, and instead of grabbing it with my hands, I just punch through the wall. Or I'm running, I want to make a quick left turn, I turn, I feel it as this entire armor, all of this momentum, smashes me through the wall, and all of a sudden I'm half stuck inside of a ship wall. But you can understand what I mean. This kind of issue of the armor goes from twitchy to very responsive to kind of accidentally dealing damage to you with its own momentum. You have a very good chance of hurting yourself if you're untrained with the armor. So again, you try and run, you might break your hip. You try to stop too quickly, you might bend your knee backwards. Or you try and grab something and you shatter a finger, or you snap a finger backward. Because of the weight and the momentum and the strength of the machine that you're piloting, and because of the fact that you're essentially having to fight with all of your muscle to use this darn suit to ensure that it's doing what you want it to, a lot of the subtlety that can be done with even power armor goes out when you're in Terminator armor. And that's part of the training, is to don't expect to be able to do all of the things that you could in power armor, because that's how you get hurt, that's how you break stuff. When I say hurting your friends, you're swinging around with your chainsword or your thunderhammer or your power fist, and all of a sudden you just do an absolute hook, and you miss, and the armor continues to twist, and you hit somebody next to you. And this can happen in the heat of battle. Terminators often fight close together in a living wall. It would not be an unreasonable statement for somebody with, say, a chain fist to take a big backswing and accidentally hit his friend. Even if he's trying his absolute best to control his momentum, it takes a lot of effort and practice to go from knowing how long it's going to take for the armor to react, knowing how hard you need to resist in order for it to remain doing what you want to do, and knowing the limitations of your flexibility so that you can effectively use this tactical dreadnought armor without hurting yourself. And really, I do mean hurting yourself, breaking bones, shattering of joints, ripping arms out of joint, theoretically getting stuck in or on or underneath something. You need to have a lot of training and practice to use these correctly. But when you do, it's horrifying. So, maintenance issues. A couple of things. A lot of Terminator armor kind of falls under that whole we don't really know how to maintain it because it's old system. Now, a lot of this gets fixed by the fact that certain forces use their Terminators in a very conservative way. They deploy them via teleportarum strike. They essentially let them take an area or control a section or, plug a gap if they need to. And then they come and get them and take care of the armor, fastidiously afterward. Every crack, every break, every scratch, it gets filled in, it gets fixed, it gets noted. That's the other thing. They'll take notes on the suit and be like, well, we had a tiny scratch in subsection A. So that time, it might be a scratch that time, but next time, if it gets hit by something again, it might be, oh, it's a crack this time. Well, let's fill that back in, fix it, and then mark it. So the maintenance for Terminator armor is closer to that of a vehicle than it is to a set of armor. And it requires a lot more personnel. You can already see over here, look how many serfs it's taking just to get this guy into his armor. Now imagine what it would be like if he came back with a whole bunch of it broken. They're going to be taking every little piece that they can and try and fit it back together like a puzzle, because if the adamantium breaks or gets damaged, that whole section needs to get sent back. If pieces of this ceramite break or get damaged, you're going to have to get whole new sections because it's just too thick. Unlike, Space Marine Power Armor, if they shattered their entire breastplate, you're not fixing that. You're going to need a replacement. It's like that with literally every piece of Terminator armor, almost. This is one of the reasons why it's such a pain to keep in a warband or to maintain in a chapter. Every time you go into a fight, every time you suffer a wound, and, God forbid, every time you lose a Terminator, you're gonna need to get every little piece of that looked at and cleaned and fixed and replaced over and over and over again. So, maintenance is an absolute nightmare. Not even including the fact that they might not have the correct maintenance for it, like, fixing the power pack or some of the arcane subsystems and the shielding, which we will talk about in a bit. All Terminator armor has a shield, whether it's a refractor shield or a crux terminatus. It doesn't seem to matter all that much. All that it really does is it flares into existence when there is particular danger to the Space Marine's life, but it really doesn't have a high chance of actually turning on, because it is powered by the armor systems, and it uses the auspex and the, its own determination of when it needs to protect itself. It also has a very long cooldown time, so effectively it might save you from the first unfortunate thing to happen to you, but you shouldn't expect it to save you consistently. So, yeah. We'll talk about that in a bit. Patterning, differences, and specialties. A bunch of Terminator armor on the Chaos side of things is all custom. Because it's either made in the Warp on Demon Forge worlds or on Dark Mechanicus worlds, or because it's gone through so much hate and punishment that it's needed to have replacement 7 or 8 times for all different types of damage. So there's a lot of, ersatz things that are put in place, taking 2 Space Marine pauldrons and putting them in place of the standard Terminator pauldrons isn't unheard of. Using steel and metal in place of adamantium isn't unheard of, but again, that's just going to decrease the protection and make it more bulky. But there's also some specialist suits, which we'll talk about when we get to patterns. So, pros and cons of Terminator armor. Over here we have some prototype Terminators. We will be talking about Saturnine pattern and prototype Terminators. And here we have a Terminator with a thunder hammer and shield fighting what looks like some very unfortunate cultists. And we'll talk about these gentlemen in a bit, because we'll be talking about pros and cons. So, the first one is full servo power. As talked about, this is both pro and con. On one side, Terminator armor is so strong that it lets you pick up and use weapons that you would never be able to physically handle
with one hand basically as a standard Marine. All of those extra servos, all of your limbs being individually powered, and basically everything short of your gauntlets being, actuated by a whole bunch of very high brace hydraulics, that is a massive advantage in terms of your strength, your power, your theoretical explosiveness if you're trained well enough with the armor. But of course, it has the downside of you can hurt yourself really badly and unintentionally just by trying to move too quickly or by trying to do a motion that you didn't want to. And even worse, you can also hurt your friends. So a lot of Terminator combat looks very stilted and slow, and that's really because that's how it's required to be. If you're not careful in tactical dreadnought armor, you have a pretty solid chance of getting yourself or somebody else that you care about killed. So full servo power is a con and a pro. Remarkable protection. This is almost entirely a pro. Your armor, even the lowest level of Terminator armor, is twice as protective as power armor. We already talked about how power armor basically has few peers in terms of protection. It will protect you from a majority of small arms. It will resist most damage from weapons in the area where it's actually armored, and the weak spots that it has, even those are protective from a lot of low gain weapons. And the Marine inside, of course, is tough. Terminator armor takes all of that and turns it up by a factor of 2. Now, the actual armored portions are really only vulnerable to the absolute pinnacle of armor-piercing weapons, and your weak spots, so to speak, are now only vulnerable to those upper-grade weapons, like autocannons, like, even bolt guns are probably not going to do much against a Terminator, but heavy bolters, you're going to be far more resistant to that. All different types of stuff, plasma as well. It is incredible protection, and it's really worth it if you want to talk about keeping a Marine alive against literally almost all odds. They can survive most things. Momentum. So, this is another plus and con that goes into full servo power again. Terminator armor is heavy, and because it's so strong, you actually can move with a disturbing level of speed. But the thing is, it's not just speed. It's also the weight that you bring behind it. A punch from a Marine will break bones. It will, shatter armor. It can crack people's skulls. A punch from a Terminator will go right through your chest cavity and kill you instantly, essentially. And even excluding things like a power fist, which is already horrifying, but a normal punch from a Terminator could probably crack weaker portions of ceramite on a Marine's armor. So, let's say a Terminator got a good run-up and just haymakered a standard Marine in the face. There's a pretty solid chance that you just shattered that Marine's faceplate, and there's even a small chance that you managed to incapacitate him just via sheer kinetic impact of snapping his head back. So, that's without any weapons. The Terminator is still absolutely capable of murdering with his bare hands, even armored and protected powerful humans, or theoretically manhandling Astartes. On the other hand, momentum can be a problem. Of course, we talked about weight with standard power armor, where it can accidentally put you through, you fall through stairs, you fall through civilian things. Don't get me started with elevators. A Marine in an elevator must really be praying to the god Emperor that he doesn't, suddenly find himself falling. He might not die, but man, he doesn't want to walk up all those stairs that are going to crumble underneath him. This gets infinitely more problematic with Terminators. They weigh, again, almost twice as much as a standard Marine. So, what might have barely held on under a Marine's tread, Terminator's just going to fall right through. And while, again, it's probably not going to hurt you all that much, because of that kind of jerky, twisty issues with all the servos, there's a chance that, trying to get up or trying to get back on your feet as a Terminator might be really difficult, and you could get hurt. The other thing is running and swinging with momentum. So, Terminators can sprint. They can kind of jog really fast, and they're a little bit like a freight train. They take a long time to get up to speed. They can remain at a consistent speed for a while, and then slowing down takes a really long time as well. And the real issue with this is when a Terminator needs to stop really quickly. and they don't have anything to brace themselves. A Terminator could easily accidentally throw themselves through a wall, even a metal one, at least part way, because they are so heavy and they can travel at such, sprinting speeds, basically. So, plus and a negative there. On the plus side, lots of strength. You can throw around your weight really easily and get incredible kinetic damage out of it. On the other hand, you can also deal that damage to yourself and get yourself stuck in places in tactical dreadnought armor. Capacity and capability. So, this has to do with how much Terminator armor can hold in terms of charge, power, auspex, weaponry, and capability has to do with the overall effectiveness of Terminator armor as, armor, as protection for a Space Marine. On the terms of capacity, they can carry bigger weapons, both melee and ranged. We can already see here that we have a shield and thunder hammer. A standard Marine would need to use the thunder hammer with two hands. Terminator can use it with essentially a hand and a shield to assist him. These salamander prototypes and or the other like prototype armor over here, obviously you're carrying like heavy weapons and big melee weapons like claws and power fists. So capacity-wise, they have plenty of room for weapons, and of course room for extra ammunition. That's the other thing. They are expected to operate for either a very short amount of time or in low-intensity conflicts for a much larger amount of time. So when we talk about like the Deathwing clearing out Space Hulks, I would call that a low-intensity conflict in which you are expected to operate for an extended period of time. Because you're fighting essentially Gene Stealers and a couple of Tyranids every now and then, you wouldn't necessarily see absolute hordes. You might, in which case you're kind of out of luck. But Terminators who have melee weapons, they don't really need reloading. But the ones who have ranged weapons, they will carry a good amount of ammo with them. Capability, again, that goes into the protection and the servo power. It is very capable of doing what Marines are supposed to do, which is to be point of the spear, shock heavy infantry. Terminators experience this in two ways. Either they are teleportarum struck, which is they get into a teleporter on a ship, there's a location or a beacon planned for them, a bunch of them literally appear out of the ether and just start wrecking house. The other way is generally Terminators aren't going to be like jogging around the battlefield, hoofing it with all their weight. They can, but if that's the case, because Terminators do better in, long hallways, urban combat, defensive roles where nobody can get behind them, or get to places where they can't access them, they're going to be deployed in the case of like large offensive where Terminators are used. They're going to be deployed from either a vehicle, which protects them until the time of deployment, or they're going to be deployed with their brothers, who will essentially watch their back while the Terminators do most of the heavy lifting. Limitations in mobility. Now, I've talked about this a little bit in terms of like, arms and legs not being able to move much. Your flexibility is limited in Terminator armor. The central chest piece and the shoulder pieces are so heavy and so large, they can actually knock into your central body, which limits your range of motion to the sides. So, bringing out an arm all the way 90 degrees from your torso is either impossible or very difficult. That is like out to the side as if you were to lift your shoulders. Lifting your arms in Terminator armor, you could probably only get level with your shoulders before you really started to strain the armor and possibly, damage your shoulder plates. So your range of motion with your arms is limited, but you can lift your arms up over your head if they're in front of you. And theoretically, you can also reach your hands about 20 degrees behind you, to the point where you could almost reach your lower back, but not exactly. So you're kind of limited a lot more than standard power armor. Your torso and waist are more heavily armored, so twisting is a lot more difficult. The other thing is because the servos are so powerful, you don't want to twist your spine too much, because theoretically, if the servos decide to kick at that moment, you could damage your spine, which would be an absolute nightmare to be stuck in Terminator armor paralyzed. And your head is very limited in its rotation. It can pretty much only go 40 degrees, maybe a little bit more, but for a lot of your senses, you're relying on auto senses or on just turning around. You have a limited movement of your head. And the thing is, the helm may look very thin on Terminator armor, but one of the important things to remember is the entire helm is adamantium. There's a thin layer of ceramite over it, but the entire helm is solid adamantium. It is one of the toughest portions of Terminator armor, is the helmet. So you'll notice me talking about in this video, the helmet is almost never going to be a weak spot, unless you're talking about the eye holes themselves, which are also smaller and thinner than those in normal Space Marine armor because you're relying on your auto senses more, and because they constitute a weak spot. So, of course, they removed a majority of the size and left them very thin, very slit-like, not big enough for a bullet to actually come through in many cases, or a bolt. And the armor itself, the helmet, is very tough adamantium. So, you can kind of rule out the head other than the back of it, and we'll talk about that in a bit. So, age and complexity. We talked about limitations in mobility. You are slower. Your legs can move a good bit, and they can raise, maybe to 80 degrees. You probably couldn't get your knee up to 90 degrees because you'd be having a hard time balancing. But, you are heavy. You're very hard to get off your feet. But you're also not as fast as a standard Astartes. And while your reaction speed is quick, the armor itself is probably going to slow you down a little bit. Not a ton. Again, the servos can be as quick as you. It's just a matter of how well you're trained and how far ahead of your enemy you are in terms of reaction time. Age and complexity. A lot of Terminator armor is vaunted, which means that it is ancient. It's from the heresy or it's from the olden days. This can lead to a couple of issues. Issues like difficulty maintaining and replacing the armor is one. The other one is just sheer degradation from age. The reactors of a lot of these armor sets are so old and they're so complicated that they can't be replaced. So they just have to keep running it and hoping that it continues working. When it stops working, real problem, Terminators cannot move without the power pack. Terminators will literally be stuck, entombed within their armor, because unlike a Marine, they cannot undress themselves. Or they cannot de-armor themselves, they can't doff their armor, almost at all, or at least with any ease. It might take hours for them to realistically pull themselves out of their armor. And without any power in the armor, that could even be worse. But once a Terminator, once their power pack is destroyed or ceases working or whatever, they're essentially stuck. They can't really run or move that much. They might be having to lay on their back because the armor is too heavy to stand up and wear. And unlike power armor where you can kind of lug it around like it's super heavy Knight's armor, Terminator armor doesn't allow you to do that. It's just too heavy. So, age and complexity, there's issues with some of the power packs. And some of the marks of armor and even some of the new armors can just have issues with maintaining. So, bare minimum versus the vaunted maximum. Again, we've talked about this with same-to-same comparisons, where we're talking about, this armor has less protection, this one has more. Just consider in general that no matter the pattern, Terminator armor is going to be protecting you twice as much as power armor in general. The bare minimum, what I'm talking about, is something like fake power armor, or fake Terminator armor, which would be something that Chaos might get their hands on, where they get a set of power armor and make a false set of Terminator armor out of it. They don't have the adamantium to put in the undersleeves or in any of the joints, so they just double up on steel. They don't have any of the extra special bits for the carapace, so they just double up or add steel to standard power armor. They build it up to mimic Terminator armor, but it isn't really that, and it has a lot of issues. So, that bare minimum versus the vaunted maximum. So, in my opinion, the absolute pinnacle of Terminator armor design, in terms of protection, which is the goal of Terminator armor, is Cataphracti. Now, there's arguments back and forth. Unlike power armor, there's a lot of actual variety to Terminator armor, which does affect its real-world function, but Cataphracti is the most protective power armor that is in common use by the entirety of the setting. It is thicker, it is heavier, it is stronger in many cases, and it is most certainly taller than any other, and yet it is more arcane and more complex, and generally the Chaos side tends to use it more than the Loyalist side, because the Loyalists value a lot of their tactile use, their speed, their agility, and of course easier maintenance than the archaic, arcane Cataphracti pattern, even if Cataphracti offers more actual protection or thickness. So, bare minimum versus vaunted maximum. Again, there's various different trade-offs for the patterns. So yeah, differences in pattern. I just went over it. There you go. So pros and cons. I'd call age and complexity a con. Bare minimum versus vaunted maximum is both a pro and a con. Limitations of mobility is a con. All right, patterns and marks. So we get to see two very nice pictures here. Who makes it and what's it made of? So ceramite and adamantium. Generally, adamantium is in the same thickness as the steel that's used in power armor. However, you can see here, this gentleman has exactly what I'm talking about. Instead of the overall black carapace making up the inner material, even though he likely does have black carapace on, or under his skin, etc., you can see the reactor back here, which is very cool, and the very thickness of this ceramite all over his body. But you can see these flat steel plates that cover a lot of the underside of the armor. That's the adamantium. That's that under skin that protects his joints, that protects his weak spots, covering up the weak areas. And even his helmet, you can see, is that adamantium shell covering him with a ceramite over it. So you can see the difference in materials here. That dark gray black and the lighter gray is that kind of thin layer of ceramite over a thicker adamantium solid skull piece. So very cool art here, and you can kind of see how that plated steel underweave is different from the thicker muscle-like black carapace. You can also see what I was talking about before when I say that every single section has more servos and more connections and looks more like a machine or a mech than power armor does. You can see all of these are attached to servos, all of these sections in his arm, his back, shoulders, bicep, elbow. His hand is sectioned off into areas controlled by his wrist. His waist, thighs, and knees are all conjoined by this sections of armor. And then you can also see there's actuators down by his toes that he can also use to start, the impulse going up to take a step forward. So that system, that almost like a rope and pulley system for moving the armor, takes a lot of training. So that's what it's made out of. Power levels and protection levels. Again, double power armor. Just think of it as, at minimum, in all respects, double the protection of power armor. Look how thick his pauldrons are. A normal Space Marine armor piece is probably just going to be as thick as this top layer. He's got a second layer almost 40% as thick, and then the adamantium weave or the adamantium armor underneath that. Adamantium weave is also an effective way of saying it, but adamantium skin suit underneath that. Power levels, again, most of these have a much larger reactor than standard power armor. They are usually pretty arcane. They're up on their backs. This version, the Indomitus pattern, is fully enclosed and armored. Most of them are, in order to prevent the Marine from becoming, incapacitated, basically. But they are much bigger. They provide more power to the Terminator armor. Movement, protection, and weaknesses. Weaknesses, penetration, analysis. Yeah. So, triple thick breastplate and double the protection everywhere else. You can see the breastplate is absolutely huge. It's similar in protection to the shoulder plates. It varies somewhat between armor. As I said, this is cataphractii armor, and you can see that it is, even compared to Indomitus pattern here, it is so much thicker. Look at the chunky gauntlets, these enormous double-sized pauldrons that go out far over his shoulder, protecting his entire, head, shoulder, and lower arm. The halo of Indomitus pattern is, very small compared to the literal arch that covers the head of cataphractii armor. And while cataphractii is, as you can see, less actuated, it's got more overlapping joints. Look at his leg in comparison to cataphractii pattern. It's enormously thick, and the joints that exist in Indomitus are often covered with ceramite, if not just larger for Indomitus than they are for Cataphract. And the ceramite is just bigger and thicker. So weaknesses, I'll go with Cataphract, and then I'll do Indomitus. So cataphractii armor, the weaknesses are really the back of the head. And this isn't to say that the back of the head or the back of the armor is a weak spot. It's just to say that you can stuff stuff in there that can explode. As said, the helmet is basically entirely ceramite-faced adamantium. So it's very solid, very tough, much tougher than a Space Marine's helmet. And while it is recessed and protected by a cowl and a gorget of ceramite, That doesn't mean that you couldn't theoretically stick a crack grenade or a firearm into this joint and fire away. It's not entirely guaranteed that you're going to damage anything, but you are at least having the chance that you damage the Marine's head, his hearing, you might break into his power pack, but this is all going to require either high gain armor piercing explosives or a high caliber weapon very close to a Terminator, which is a dangerous place to be. The underside of the arms in Terminator armor in both types is a vulnerability. It is a thicker joint than it is in standard Space Marine armor. You're not going to be getting through this with your bayonet, but possibly a chainsword if it's of good quality. You could try and grind away at the arm. There are joints on the top of the shoulder, but this is such a small spot that you probably literally couldn't get a chainsword in there. And all the Terminator has to do is hunch his shoulder, and you're going to be trapped within his melee range, which is a horrible place to be because they will rip you to pieces. The underside of the arm, in Cataphractii, this is protected by like armored slats. In Indomitus, it's protected by essentially the Marine's arm and his ability to, shrug off or keep you away from the underside of his protection. The waist of most Terminator armor is a weak spot just because it is thinner than the large kind of barrel chest that is their chest protection. However, in Cataphractii, it seems to me that a lot of the waist protection is made of adamantium covered in ceramite, whereas in Indomitus and other patterns, it is ceramite covered adamantium, but there are joints and gaps where it's just adamantium. So, Cataphractii armor, again, winning out just by a little bit. The waist and hips, kind of this triangle from the bottom of the breastplate to the top of both hips, are one of the only places other than the forearm, or sorry, the bicep, that you will find weak spots on Cataphractii Terminator armor. The back of the armor is about as protected in terms of like the power pack as most other sections of it. It's at least going to be 2 inches thick of solid ceramite, which is going to be a very high ask for a majority of weapons, even mild armor piercing weapons. You're definitely going to require something that's heavily armor piercing or is a heavy weapon. We're talking like vehicle capable weapons to try and damage that level of armor. Like the shoulder pads and the breastplate. But the other weak spot on Carapace, other than the inside of the thighs, the upper thighs occasionally, and the kind of stomach area where it might be slightly weaker, are the edges of the gauntlets and the upper forearm or the bicep. These, in Indomitus pattern, there's a gap here, and there's sections here that can be damaged that are just covered by the adamantium weave. Same thing for Cataphractii armor. It has a section here that isn't covered by the ceramite. It's just covered by, black adamantium weave, and that's what these kind of hanging pauldrons are for. They are, in theory, much like the one around the waist, meant to protect or at least mitigate some damage from ranged weapons that might end up hitting that spot. So, again, protection, incredible. Very little can actually get through this, and the stuff that does, Melta, Plasma, las cannons, all that kind of high gain, designate armor piercing, all of those weapons have a higher chance to, but you still have to aim for weak spots in order to guarantee killing the Marine in a timely manner, effectively. So, talking about the previous page for a second, I know I've gone on. We have Indomitus pattern, which I usually call the happy medium of the armor. It has a good amount of mobility. It's not the most mobile, but it is, has more mobility for the arms and legs. You can use a lot of different armors. It's the premier one that's used in the modern day Imperium. And it's relatively average. It's just kind of medium in all ways. It's got a lot of nice armor systems, and it has that kind of, not horned, but like boar's head helm that is kind of really specific to Indomitus. Then Cataphractii, that's our walking tank we've been talking about. It's the very earliest form of mass-produced Terminator armor. It's practically immune to most weaponry, like a lot of Terminator armor, but even more than most Terminator armor, it prioritizes defense, and it is the most protective armor in common use in all Space Marine factions. So it's the most protective of the ones in common use of all factions. So, down here on the left, I've picked out Night Lords specifically because there's some very cool art of them in it. We have Tartarus pattern. Now, Tartarus is a bit of a strange design, or a bit of a strange choice, I should say. It takes Indomitus, it takes what they tried to do with Indomitus, which is make Cataphractii armor that sacrifices a little bit of its protection for a lot more mobility. And Tartarus kind of went the other direction, and it took standard power armor, and then it tried to buff it up to the level of protection of Terminator armor. So that's my reasoning for this. You can see this in the way that the shoulder pads and the helmet look. They are much more in the way of standard power armor than they are Terminator armor, and though they share a lot with Indomitus, including the kind of overhood, they share a lot with Cataphractii, including the overhood and the recessed helmet. The helmet is much more in the way of standard Space Marine helmets than it is the standard like Terminator. It doesn't look exactly like Cataphractii. You can see Cataphractii is kind of ridged and domed. It has a sharp side, and the gorget comes up to cover almost half of the face. Whereas with Tartarus, the gorget is lower, it is thinner, the overall build-up is really just to protect the power pack at the rear, and Tartarus is kind of a light power armor. I'm not saying it's any less protective, but if you look at it, you can see that the greaves are less scalloped and less, sectioned. There's not as many double or triple cover up. There's not as many layers. Their thighs are much more in the type of standard Space Marine armor, and even though they've tried to cover it with some skulls and human skin here, you can see that there are larger sections of the waist that are open to vulnerable damage. And they've made, advances to try and keep this from happening by bulging out the ceramite of the breast piece and giving you kind of a groin and gut plate that is, more in line with the armor on the thighs and arms than it is with the true chest piece of the Tartarus. So Tartarus is a little bit lighter. It's a little bit lighter protected, but it is also much faster. So it's quicker, it's a little bit more mobile because it's built on more of a power armor matrix and less of a how do we take Cataphractii armor and make it less incredibly heavy. So some people really like this because of its smooth lines. I'm not a huge fan of it, but it does rank just below or even with Indomitus pattern, in my opinion. Sauterine and prototype armor. So this is what I like to call the controversy generator. You saw on the first page, or on the second page, those, it calls them Salamander Prototype Terminator Armor. Now, there's a lot of prototypes for Terminator Armor that have, gained traction as looking really cool, or being really fancy. The only one that I can really point to and say, this has come up too many times for me to not mention it, is Sauterine, or Saturnine Prototype Terminator Armor. It looks like this. It's very, it's in the Death of Hope, which is where I first got introduced to it, and I think it looks beautiful in Death of Hope. But it's very much a flat face, almost dreadnought style of armor, where the Marine is encased within a solid, a bulwark of armor that goes above his head and back, and he is practically immersed in his own shoulders. As you can see, Sauterine is big, it's heavy, it's thick. It kind of takes Cataphract armor and smooths out all the rough edges and lines. Instead of having two doubled up pauldrons that go out straight from the shoulders, it just makes two absolutely enormous shoulder pieces that, as you can see here, go from the top of the armor all the way down to the elbow of the Marine. And now you might say, well, isn't that a horrible design? Yes, it really is. But it's incredible. Look at it for a second, for real. The flat face, there's no weak points on here. Very little space like there is in Cataphract armor. The entire front, this pavis, this kind of almost front plate of a tank, covers down every single section of the armor. These shoulder pads cover every part of the head, most of the power pack, and these thigh and calf boots and all calf boot areas are all on par with Cataphract armor in terms of toughness. The only weaknesses to Sauterine armor are the extreme limitations to your mobility, even worse than Cataphractii armor. You can only bend your arm a certain degree and lift it out a certain degree before the armor actually interferes with itself. The difficulty in looking left and right when your head's effectively recessed into your protection. And it's only got 2 weak points, which are the undersides of this kind of front plate, and both of those are obviously below the position of the Marine's chest. So, in reality, this is an incredible thing that has basically become a fan-made armor set. Most of the art for it is non-official. What is official is just labeled as prototype armor. I'm pretty sure that even the name Sauterine or Satyrine is maybe it was mentioned once, but I have no idea if it's canon or not. And I just felt the need to mention it because if there was one thing that I love about the setting is that people, if they all agree on something being the way that it is, it is that way. We are the ones who kind of make up the canon in a lot of ways, where either the actual creators of the setting don't care, or where a majority of the people can decide that the actual lore is kind of dumb. So, in my opinion, taking away something this cool and just kind of blowing it off and saying that, the fan creation that it kind of is not really valid, I disagree with. I'm not going to say that it's a common pattern that gets used. It's if it existed at any point in the canon, it was absolutely a prototype, and it probably would have only been given out to a couple of Marines. But you know, believe what you want to believe. I really like this stuff. It's definitely not my favorite. My favorite is still Cataphracti, but it ranks up there in the lists if we include it. And the last one is Aegis Terminator armor, or sparkly magic armor. So, all that Aegis really is, it's the Grey Knight's armor. It's the ones that they wear. It's it's gotten super hype because the Space Marine effect with Grey Knights goes absolutely crazy. And so, Grey Knight players and Grey Knight readers and Grey Knight writers all want to make everything that the Grey Knights do or touch so much better than the Marines, who are already so much better than everyone else, that we're kind of getting onto, exponential levels of hype here, or overhype. All it really is a interesting mix between Cataphracti and Indomitus armor. The head, covering, and shoulders are all kind of Indomitus pattern, but when we get down to these legs, they look much more in this classic Cataphracti style. So it almost looks like you took bits and pieces from each that were more chosen, or more choice, and then you retrofitted them into a new set of armor. What is unique about Aegis armor is that it is literally magic. So the silver coating, as well as all the wards, the engrams, the writings, and the enchantments are magical. They are psychically active to join with the Grey Knight brother in order to create this psychic barrier, this ward surrounding him, where his armor doesn't interfere with his psychic potential. Many of them have hoods, psychic hoods that help guide their powers, but a majority of it is just the armor is actually warded against chaos, and it is a physical protection in addition to being a psychic one. So really all it is it's literally just magic Terminator armor. It is Terminator armor that has been psychically warded and protected and kind of purified so that a psychic marine of the Grey Knight's caliber, which is less than a librarian, can use it to channel their powers. So, unique weapons and equipment, melee defense, ranged, heavy, weird, combi, mastercrafting, honorable mentions, gravis, and heavy power armor. So, let's start with these pictures over here. Here we have a side cutoff of Indomitus pattern power armor. Goodness. We have our subatomic reactor, the cooling system out the back. This gives us an image of the radiator grill. This is really one of the few weak spots on the armor. It's on the rear, but it is also, you can see, below the actual reactor. So if you shot through this, you would just be hitting the rest of the armor. The actual reactor is up above on the Marine's back. You can see the magnetic coils and all the other pieces that help move the leg. It's talking about how the soles of the shoes are magnetic. That's true for all power armor. The power armor control system in the Indomitus pattern says that it's in the chest. I would really point to that as more the location of the initial mount points of the Marine's armor. So obviously the first thing to go with a lot of Terminator armor is the chest piece, and from there a lot of the armor is built out. So one of the most initial or the first connections that the Marine has with the armor is via the control system in the chest. It has a tactical camera. Probably allows you to see behind you as well as in front of you. And of course the Vox and respirator system and the Marine inside of it. You can see they almost fight in a stooped crouch or with their head kind of forward. And they're bending the knees to try and fit through hallways and such. Over here we have Our Lady of the Inquisition. So I would like to point out a couple of things about this armor. This is when we get into what does Terminator armor look like for humans. It looks absolutely obscenely large. It's huge on people, and it allows them to use crazy weapons like this, which is likely I would say an 8 or 9 foot long power spear. But yeah, you can see that from this woman's height, her feet are probably only reaching the inside of this greave. She's probably not even close to touching the ground right now, let alone touching the inside of her armor. Her hands might be in here, but again, effectively for a human, it's more like piloting a mech. It's more like being inside of something where, you're having to use control surfaces rather than actively gripping something. You're gripping a object that controls the mechanical fingers in the armor. This is incredibly complicated, and it's one of the reasons why Terminator armor for humans and even for Marines can be hard to, manufacture and create. It has a lot of electrical subsystems that are temperamental, complex, small, intricate, annoying to create in general. But even for the Inquisition, this is a beautiful set of armor. Genuinely, it's set up with all these beautiful pieces. It's well scrolled. It's got inlay. You can see the power of these servo legs and motors. And look at her head. Look at how small she is in this. If you counted out her shoulders, they probably don't even fill up the breastplate. So she's definitely reaching her arms out almost straight from her body to try and get to control surfaces in the arms. So it almost looks like a walker mech if you were to kind of outline where she is in the protection. But all that also means for humans, there's a lot of portions of this armor where you could break through the armor, but you won't actually hurt her. Only really the chest area, which you can see here, is practically the size of an ancient oak. And the waist area, which you can see as well, is double reinforced, has extra coverings, and the enormous shoulder plates where you're actually going to kill the Inquisitor. So, unique weapons and equipment. A lot of Terminators use combi weapons, as we've been over throughout this. The melee weapons that they tend to use, the most standard Terminator layout for weaponry is a power fist. We will go over power weapons and chain weapons and miscellaneous weapons in one of the upcoming videos, hopefully. But a power fist and a storm bolter. Or a combi bolter. The reason for the storm bolter or combi bolter over the standard bolter is because they can use it with one hand. And because they need that extra firepower to, spray down areas. One of the interesting things about the storm bolter is it's also easier for a Terminator to reload. Because it uses large box magazines that hold around 60 rounds, they can grab it with their other hand, pull it off, and reload it much more easily than trying to fiddle around with smaller 30-round magazines. Now, with combi weapons, this essentially means that they kind of rig the combi weapon, magazines together so that they can grab them with one hand, rip both of them out, and then slam another pair in. But this also means that because they're using combi weapons, they can use other types of combi weapons. So combi plasma, combi melta, anything of that nature, absolutely allowed, and not all that uncommon. Mastercrafted sets of Terminator armor. These really come into that whole thing of how do you mastercraft power armor. There is higher quality and lesser quality. There is fancy and non-fancy. There are ones with better shielding and protection systems. Again, you don't want to rely on the shield. The Crux Terminatus is almost random. It is something that can save your life, but I've rarely seen it activate on Terminators very often. And when it does, it's kind of like it flashes into existence for a heartbeat, and it protects you from something that was coming in fast and hot, something nasty like an overcharged plasma shot or something like that, or a crack missile or something like that. But it probably won't save your life every time, and it certainly isn't reliable. Especially in armor that might be newer or armor that might be of subpar quality. But mastercrafting generally, you just want to tweak something about the armor, whether it's protection, strength. A lot of the times, mastercrafting armor has to do with pairing a weapon with it. So, for example, this power spear is probably made specifically for her in this armor. So it might be something of that nature. Honorable mentions are Gravis and Heavy Power Armor. Gravis is part of that new lore that doesn't yet have a ton of information I can help with. Gravis seems to have kind of variable protection, up to the level of Terminator armor, but not quite as protective. So it almost looks like it's Tartarus armor that they're using thin, lacquered layers of ceramite instead of the big heavy chunks that they use for Tartarus. So it's lighter, it's more flexible, but it offers a similar level of protection, or at least superior levels of protection to standard power armor. Heavy power armor. This is a thing that you will see sometimes again when it comes to those fake sets of power armor, whether it's for like Inquisitors who don't want to, who aren't quite at the Terminator armor level, but they kind of have like a mini Cataphracti suit, or they have power armor that's set up in such a way that it is more protective, but it isn't quite to the level of strength of Cataphracti yet, or other Terminator armors. The other one is Chaos power armor that gets built up over time. So quite often you'll see like warlords or champions who have particularly powerful sets of armor. They're often of the heresy pattern, and they're either manipulated physically or chaotically in order to be more protective. So honorable mention, it's not quite Terminator armor, much like Gravis, but it is offering you more protection than standard power armor. Finally, we get to users, importance, and logistics, and some really interesting art I want to talk about. So, let's go from the bottom up here. Inquisition. So, as you saw in the previous slide, the Inquisition does use human-patterned Terminator armor. Generally, it's the Ordo Malleus, and sometimes it's the Ordo Xenos if they're dealing with Tyranids a lot of the time. They'll want Terminator armor so that they don't get murked or slaughtered by lictors or anything like that. They have a chance to fight back against stuff that would normally absolutely kill them. But Malleus will use it because they fight demons. And Terminator armor can protect you from a lot of weapons that demons use. Hellblades, claws that can cut through ceramite and chop through, limbs and protection and things like that. Stuff that you normally wouldn't have resistance against, even in power armor, or could still wound you in power armor. The Inquisition is going up against these threats on a consistent basis, so having a set of Terminator armor, even if it's just of the human pattern, is not unreasonable. Matter of fact, it might be a requirement if you really want to risk going into the warp a whole lot and fighting the enemies of mankind in their homeland. Terminator armor is going to keep you alive. It's going to help you deal with things like the repercussions of demon magic and chaos magic, fighting witches and other things, and of course, the Ordo Malleus has to fight other Marines. If I had to choose to fight a Chaos Space Marine and I was a human, I would much rather pick a set of Terminator armor where I could theoretically overpower my centuries-older opponent who has had, a million times as much experience than me, or I would rather have Terminator armor rather than have power armor and attempt to have an even fight with him. I definitely want every advantage I can get, no matter how expensive. So for Marines, they still field Terminators in squads of 5 and squads of 10. Sometimes they're in even bigger groups, and you'll see them around Primarchs, you'll see them around Chapter Masters. They are the first company. They are the most important individuals. They'll generally be, kept back for a lot of deployments. They are the vaunted, most important individuals in the chapter in terms of, they're honored with the Terminator armor. That's very important. And I'd also like to point to this picture. It's very important. Look at how high he's raising his arm. This is right up in front of him. He is firing a storm bolter with one hand while walking forward. And look at his stance. He's actually stanced up to support his weight with one arm, and he's effectively using the recoil of his storm bolter as a way to support himself. So you can see that his shoulder and chest are leaned forward, and his legs are split back, and he's leaning into the recoil to keep his gun accurate. I think this is a beautiful example of how Terminators can use the storm bolter in ways that a normal Marine would never have a chance to. Moving on. Marines, the Terminators for the Imperials are generally held in reserve unless there's something super important going on, so something that really has to be protected, or someone who has to really be protected, or, line breakers or insertions, things like that. When they put in the Terminators, it is not really an option to break down and retreat. They don't have that choice as Terminators. You can try and teleportarum them away, but teleportarum strikes and teleportarum removal can be dangerous and difficult, it would be much safer for Marines who are wearing such important pieces or even relics of the chapter's history to come back via conventional means. So they will deploy them in areas where, yeah, they're going to be there for maybe a little bit without support, but there's probably a greater offensive that they're going to be supporting by being there. So they'll send them into an enemy command bunker via teleportation, and then they'll assault the bunker from the outside when the Terminators are getting there. To make sure that the Terminators don't get surrounded, run out of ammo, and get overwhelmed. That's the last thing they want. For Chaos, we have two pictures here. We have an Iron Warrior with a addition to the armor, a rocket pack. So when we talk about unique weapons, one of them is the Hellfire rocket racks or the Iron Hail rocket racks. This is essentially just a missile launcher on the back of the Marine. Obviously, they can use a lot of melee weapons, both power weapons. You've seen throughout this video claws, power swords, chain fists is another one I don't think I got a picture of, and of course, combi bolters, and in this case, storm bolters. But these two are both in this guy's in semi-cataphract, and this guy's in full cataphracti armor. So the Chaos side of things, they use mixed patterns, which means that, as you can see, this gentleman who looks like he's wearing a fridge and aiming a microwave, he has an augmetic for a leg, he might have an augmetic for a hand, he has flat plates put down his chest that are clearly mismatched and meant to guard his groin. He has a plate over here. And if you look, this is kind of the more traditional cataphracti. His shoulder plate is different. He's clearly in a cataphracti pattern. Look, you can see the steepling over his head. You can see the massive barrel chest. But where's his gorget? Where is the, where's the oversize of this? Where's the protection for his shoulders? Where's his second set of, flat pavis plates on his shoulders for the cataphracti armor? This is what I mean by mixed patterns. It's pretty clear that sections like his leg, sections like his other leg, sections like the side of his armor, this looks like it's almost taken from other Marines as spoils, and he's essentially bolted it on to create the illusion of Terminator armor. I would absolutely believe that this was a standard Space Marine breastplate essentially stuck on top of another breastplate. So you can see he kind of looks very big, very clunky. He's having a little bit of a hard time moving. Obviously, he's missing limbs. I don't want to judge him. He's wounded. But clearly, he's still enjoying a great level of protection, even though he's been severely wounded and he's using a mixed pattern. Deployment. This is a real question mark. A lot of Terminators in Chaos Forces are going to be leaders. So you'll see a warband lord or a warband leader in Terminator armor. Why? Two reasons. One, so that the other Marines don't think of him as weak, and try and stab him on the back while on deployment. You want to be protected from the front as well as the rear when you have friends as terrible as other Chaos Space Marines. But the other thing is, you can't have the inquisitorial assassins or a random champion of the Imperium decide he wants to make a name for himself and kill your leader, because once the leader of a warband dies, it can kind of crush the organization as a whole. There are plenty of warbands that have come back from having their leader killed, or even ones that have, not even stopped fighting, have continued, not really caring that their leader was dead. But you don't want that to happen if you're the leader. So rather than maybe give the Terminator armor to a subordinate if you don't really trust them, or if you think that you could use it better, a lot of Chaos Warlords choose to deploy with Terminator armor because it gives them the leg up, and because it protects them from all different types of threats, both real and imagined. The other thing is, when you have more than one or more than a couple of Terminators, they are mostly deployed defensively. When they're deployed on the offensive, it's because every hand is being thrown into the fight. If you have a Space Marine Terminator, that is probably the only set of armor you're ever going to get, unless you're part of a much larger organization, like a Reformed Legion, or some sort of group that exists that has, 10 or more Terminators. So, the one set of Terminator armor for the entire warband, that might be. And if you're the guy who has it, you're only gonna get deployed if it's a victory or death scenario. So, Chaos Terminators are horrifying. They're absolutely terrifying. They sometimes have absolutely insane skill, talent, weaponry, equipment, blessings, sometimes enchantments straight up on the armor or weapons, but they can also have some limitations, like our gentleman over here: injuries, wounds, replacements, subpar equipment. Uh, all of this can either hamper or enhance their deployment. So, acknowledgements. Looky here, new memes for the boys. Please note, new memes. Friendship is magic, and magic is heresy. I certainly agree. Brother, get the flamer, the heavy flamer. We will be doing a video on flamers, I hope, at some point, but I don't think anyone needs extra information on how a flamethrower works. I'll see what you guys think in the next couple videos. And of course, according to this video, I am indeed a heretic. Enough of that absolute memery. Thank you all so much for sticking with me. I'm sorry that I made you wait so long. I will make it up to you. I will do a double upload tonight. We will be going through it, gentlemen and ladies. We have this one, obviously the video on Terminator armor, and then we have a video on Plasma and Melta. Then, after that, even better, I've got something extra for you. At the end of that video, I'll be posting a little poll for you guys so that you can help me decide what the next video is going to be. I really hope that you enjoyed this. I'm surprised it went on so long, and I wish you all a lovely, good... Whoop. Uh-oh. Oh, goodness. A lovely good night.